Hello, everyone. Good morning. Good afternoon for the ones watching us in Europe. Good evening for the ones watching us from Asia, from the Asia region. So we're here for our third masterclass on our digital capitalism course. My name is Sofia Scasserra. I am a researcher at TNI, the Transnational Institute. So far, we had a lot of feedback in the first two master classes with more than 100 people actively participating simultaneously. We thank you very much for your participation, and your questions and comments have generated very valuable exchanges. Unfortunately, we cannot answer all of them, but we hope that along the weekly digest, our answers in the forums and the master classes, you can profit from the exchange. Now, our third week has started. We are so excited about it, also because the issue about inequality was one of the biggest concerns in the forums and the Q&A in the masterclass. Also, we want to say we're sorry because the 1 hour warning of this masterclass went earlier than it should have been this morning. We got messed up with the system, but it's already fixed. So sorry about that for the ones who showed up earlier and it wasn't the correct time for our masterclass. Now to you, Pia. You're on mute, darling.
Can you hear me now? Yes, perfect. So hello, welcome everyone. It's nice to see you once again. We are going to see our third class. Here are our course partners, so you can check them out and see their pages, their websites. Also, we have our course organizers, which includes Nick, Sofia, who just spoke, myself, Jess, Jorit, and Guillermo. This is really important for us, and we are really excited. We also clarify that TNI has a policy to use wherever possible open source technologies. So this course was put together using Moodle, Nextcloud, Ubuntu, but this isn't always possible because of the monopoly power. That is why we also are using Zoom in order for all of you to be able to attend and absorb as many people as we are doing right now. Here's also the course program. We are, as we said, on our third class. In our Moodle website, you can check out not only the core reading, but also the further reading materials and the videos. You can also check out the activities, the online activities, which are the quizzes, or also some mentees and forums. And I also exchange with you in some of the forums, and it's interesting to see your inputs. It's nice to exchange with all of you. Now we are in our third week, and as for our weeks to come, we have our next topics. Oh, sorry, we are already with our speakers. So our goal in this session today is to complement the materials we have read in the course, and also to allow you to ask questions from experts in the field. Remember that the masterclass is also being uploaded later on in the module session. You can ask your questions throughout the session via the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And throughout the session, we'll be sharing links to resources and further reading in the chat box. We also know that there's a lot of knowledge among the attendees, so feel free to share your thoughts and links too. Now, in this class, we're going to be exchanged with Ulises Mejias, I will be presenting soon, Paola Ricuarte, and Nandini Chami. We are really glad to have them join in this session. Maybe, okay, perfect. Now, first, before beginning and presenting our speakers, does anyone know what this emoji means? You can insert your comments in the chat box. Not sure if I'm receiving any comments. A great drink, someone is saying. Do we have any other comments? Do you know what this emoji actually means? My morning, perfect, very bitter. Okay. Well, some people are already recognizing it. Well, this is a mate drink. It is a famous beverage which is drunk mostly hot, but also cold. And it's very traditional in many South American countries, mainly in Paraguay, in Uruguay, and in Argentina. But this was recognized as an emoji after a heroic battle fought by 5 Argentinian people who wrote several pages just to justify its cultural value in 2017. This is many people who are absorbing the South American culture. But however, many people think it's a relaxing emoji as it looks like a coconut with a straw. I know that it is a very small issue in terms of cultural acknowledgement, and describing it as a battle can be kind of funny. But imagine how many things which are not that visible could be experiencing the same thing. In other words, technology made by northern countries without taking into account the non-developed countries. So this is just to raise conscience in that sense. In this sense, also, you have already raised many questions on this matter. Why does digital colonialism, for example, only lead to growth in a few countries? Does every country generate and extract data? Who owns it? What's the impact on labor markets? What's the difference between the global north and the global south? These questions were really enriching, and we hope that we'll be able to answer many of them in this session. And this is why I'm really, really glad to be joined by 3 great speakers who know a lot of digital colonialism, and from whom we are going to learn a lot. Our first speaker is, as I said, Ulises Mejias, who is a professor of communication studies at SUNY Oswego, who co-founder of the Non-Aligned Technologies Movement and the network Tierra Común, which you can check on the website. He's also a researcher on critical internet studies, network theory and science, philosophy of technology, sociology of data, and political economy of digital media, and co-author of Data Grab, the New Colonialism of Big Tech, and How to Fight Back. Paola Ricuarte, who is also the second speaker, is an associate professor in the Department of Media and Digital Culture at the Tecnológico de Monterrey and a faculty associate at Berman Klein Center for Internet and Society at the Harvard University. Alongside Nick Coldry and Ulises Mejias, who is our first speaker, she co-founded Tierra Común, a network of academics, practitioners, and activists interested in decolonizing data. She actively participates in several expert committees, including the Global Partnership for Artificial Intelligence, the GPI, the Global Index Responsible AI, and the expert group for the implementation of the UNESCO recommendation of the ethics of artificial intelligence. Paola is also a member of the A+ Alliance for Inclusive Algorithms and leads the Latin American and Caribbean hub of the Feminist AI Research Network, where she regionally coordinates the incubated Feminist AI project. And last but not least, Nandini Chami, who is the Deputy Director of IT for Change, one of our course partners actually. Her work largely focuses on research and policy advocacy in the domains of digital rights and development, and the political economy of women's rights in the information society. She is also part of the organization's advocacy efforts around the 2030 Development Agenda on issues of data for development and digital technologies and gender justice. She also provides strategic support to IT for Change's Field Center, and this includes training for programs for women's rights groups on adopting digital tools on their field practice, and critical education for empowerment for rural adolescent girls. She has a master's in urban and rural community development from the Tata Institute of Social Science in Mumbai. Now, for this third session, we want to let our speakers give us an input of their experience and knowledge. So as we start the conversation, do add your questions in the Q&A, as you may have done before. And we are starting with Ulises first. Ulises, we are exploring today the vast meaning of colonialism in the digital world. And therefore, we thought about first asking you, what do you think about the concept? In other words, why do you think it's critical to understand digital capitalism today?
Thank you very much. I'm flattered to be here today and to be able to share some experiences and observations with all of you. Also particularly pleased to be sharing the stage with Paola and Nandini, whose work I really admire. So I'm looking forward to just learning from them. So I think what I thought we could do is, even though we're not, I don't intend to take up too much time, I do have just a few slides to share with you, just to introduce the concept of data colonialism. I'm not exactly sure how familiar you are with the basic concepts. So I thought this way we can just go over the basics. So just a few slides. I do want to also point out, as has already been mentioned, that this work is co-authored with Nick Coldry at the London School of Economics. And as a matter of fact, our new book just came out. It's called Data Grab, The New Colonialism of Big Tech and How to Fight Back. So if you are in the US, you can get it through University of Chicago Press. If you are in the UK or that side of the Atlantic, you can get it through Penguin. So let me just talk about the basic concept of data colonialism. And our argument, Nick's and my argument, is that the role of data in society today can be or should be understood in a larger historical context. In other words, we're talking not just about the 50 years of internet history, but we want to place it in a larger historical context of 500 years of colonialism. And that's why we developed this concept of data colonialism, which might seem a bit of a weird concept if you think about it. We're putting together two words that seemingly don't have much to do with each other. We have colonialism, which I think most of us think of something that has to do with the past, with history. And then we have data, which is something of the present or of the futures, specifically digital data. So to help us understand why we're putting together these two words, the first thing I want to do is just give you some quick statistics to kind of provide this historical context. We know that historic colonialism was about capturing land, capturing territory. And here you can see some basic statistics from the period from 1800 to 1875. Colonialism acquired something like 215,000 square kilometers of territory every year. This is roughly equivalent to the territory of Guyana each year being added to various empires. From 1875 to 1914, that number increased quite a bit to 620,000 square kilometers, which is about the size of Ukraine, being added to colonialism every year. By the time World War II came around, 1 in 3 people were living under colonial rule. Now, let's compare that with data colonialism, which instead of capturing land, I think we can say that it captures human life through this medium of data. And obviously, since it's not about land, it's obviously about data. Here are some interesting statistics. Last year, 3 in 8 people used Facebook, 1 in 8 used TikTok. Last year, we were generating about 329 million terabytes of data per day. And it is estimated by 2025, we will have 181 zettabytes of data in total. 1 zettabyte equals 1 trillion gigabytes. So we're talking about a lot of data. Where does this data come from? Obviously from us. And so when we talk about data colonialism, we're talking about this process that started, yes, with the invention of the internet, but more specifically with the realization that corporations could do something with all of this data. And to give you a sense of what that thought process was like, here is a quote from Google's chief economist, Hal Varian, who in 2013 wrote, "There is now a computer in the middle of virtually every transaction, as we know. Because transactions are now computer mediated, we can observe behavior that was previously unobservable." and more importantly, write contracts on it. So this is at the basis of data colonialism, this ability to write contracts on data transactions, to monetize them. So to give you a definition of what data colonialism is, the way Nick and I think about it, we say that it's an emerging order for the appropriation of human life so that data can be continuously extracted from it for profit. So we're not saying all data is bad. We're not against all data. We're specifically talking about this process of extraction of data from our daily lives for the sole purpose of creating wealth for some, inequality for others. And yes, of course, we want to be mindful that when we talk about colonialism, there are lots of differences. We're not saying that data colonialism is exactly the same as historic colonialism. There are differences in terms of the scale, the intensity, the location. But we are saying that there is one key similarity, and that is that both kinds of colonialism have the same function. That function is to dispossess, to extract. How? By controlling a new kind of territory, a data territory. So just a couple more points about data colonialism. Nick and I sort of insist that we must see it as more than just another capitalist innovation. There's a lot of proposals that try to explain what is happening just in terms of capitalism. We are saying we need to broaden our scope. It goes beyond capitalism. It's an entirely new social order that extends colonial extraction in new ways, including, as we're seeing lately, generative AI and other forms of AI. And an important point here is that the reason we argue it's not just about capitalism is because we're trying to make the point that there wouldn't be capitalism without colonialism. The wealth generated in the plantations, to put it simplistically, finance the factories of industrial capitalism. So without that accumulation and that transfer of wealth, there wouldn't even be capitalism. So just to give you an idea of sort of like the justification, the rationalization that happens when we think about data colonialism, let's start with the concept of cheap nature. When colonizers set out to conquer the world, they had to render or they had to define nature as something that was cheap. It was just there. It was abundant. It was free. It was just there for the taking, right? It was uninhabited. Of course, we know that there were people living in many of those territories, but from the perspective of the colonizer, those people were not even civilized, which meant that they could acquire, Europeans could acquire that territory. To convert that nature into wealth, you needed a lot of cheap labor if you were a colonizer. So, of course, as we know, colonialism was a racial order where some human beings were seen as naturally predisposed to generate wealth. And so we have this progression from cheap nature to cheap labor to, we argue now, cheap data. And if you think about it, cheap data has many of the same characteristics. It is said to be abundant. It is said to be free. It's just there for the taking. It doesn't have an owner. You and I might produce it, but corporations who have the advanced technology, only they can refine it, can process it to turn it into something useful. That they can do something with it, and we're told that this is what progress looks like. We're told that this is what modernity and looks like, and prosperity. So our job is just to produce it. Okay, let me skip around because I want to end. What can we do about all of this? I'm sure Paola and Anthony are going to talk more about it, but I do want to end with this quote from Timnit Gebru, who said, "We need to let people who are harmed by technology imagine the future that they want, to imagine an alternative future." So I think right now we're seeing a very unequal order in which only a few voices get to tell us what progress and what prosperity looks like. And we do agree with Timnit here that the creation of techno-social systems needs to be a larger conversation. And especially it needs to be a conversation that includes those who are mostly harmed by technologies, because data colonialism, after all, is a continuation of the colonial legacy that discriminates, that oppresses certain groups of people more than others. All right, so I just wanted to kind of like give you a very broad overview of what data colonialism is. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ulises. It's really interesting to see how the concept has changed, but at the same time conserved many factors, and the fact that there is no colonialism without capitalism. I think it's really interesting to dig into that. Then we wanted to move forward to Nandini and to explore the different conceptions of colonialism in the digital world, especially with a feminist perspective. Now, Nandini, for you, which are the key dimensions of digital colonialism, and why and how should we integrate a feminist perspective?
Thank you for the question. And I just want to start by reaffirming one point that Ulises said, that there is nothing innate in the technological revolution that it can only go on this path-dependent way of reinforcing the data capitalism, colonialism nexus. And so we don't need to be deterministic about it. And there are other ways of reclaiming the technological revolution for other ways of ordering society. And this is my starting point. And because of this, the key dimension of the problem that I see is a rise of a different truth regime that orders society. So just like if you look at historical colonialism, we are all familiar with how population statistics and statistical reason became the means of ordering territories and peoples and disciplining them. We are witnessing the rise of a new form of data governmentality or algorithmic reason. And some people have written extensively about like what they call the cult of dataism, the belief that, large data sets offer a higher form of intelligence and knowledge that can generate insights that were previously impossible with the aura of truth, objectivity, and accuracy. And somehow data becomes equal to uncontested truth, which can then be used as the only way in which society, markets, the social contract, and the public sphere, and many other parts of our social life and our choices have to be ordered. So this is what I see as the most difficult problem that we are grappling with today. And in terms of tackling it, what does feminism actually offer us? I think that a feminist perspective would first force us to think about what is the end of digitalization and the data revolution and data and AI technological development. So do we want to build a social order where human life and nature is just fodder for capital? Because that is how the current data colonialist regime is structured. Or do we think of transformative societies which will further substantive equality and the vision of intersectional gender justice, respecting the choices and the right to free choice for those who are furthest from the first? So it's about the kind of society, the knowledge societies that we seek to build. And working towards this would, for me, be the feminist perspective to address digital colonialism. So from that starting point, I think that I just want to put three concrete, somewhat concrete proposals on the table on how else we could think about the digital and data revolution, and then hear your feedback and also reflections and criticisms of this and everything. So the first is that I think we need to challenge the dogma that more data is necessarily better. So the questions that I have for all of us is, what parts of our lives should we allow to be guided by datafication as an ordering principle? And what paths should we keep outside the circuit of datafication? So just to make this very real with practical examples, I think all of us, including from the wonderful reading material that was circulated ahead of the session, we're all familiar with the cases of algorithmic decision making, data-based decision making in predictive policing and welfare systems. There was the case of the Australia robo-debt scandal that was put in the reading material, for instance. And the entire focus seems to be that if only we could somehow perfect the data and algorithm and fix the problem of proxy discrimination, data would somehow give us the perfect answer without having human fallibility in it. This is what bureaucrats everywhere, including in the global south, talk about. And this forgets the fact that there is no such thing as raw data and some kind of objective reality uncontaminated by the operations of socio-political power, right? Because the act of generating insight from data in itself reflects social power and how it operates in the codification and construction of knowledge systems. So how do we actually address these issues? We need to think about it differently from just looking at furthering this culture of dataism and this technical mathematical formalism to arriving at perfecting data-based decision making. And similarly, I also want to point out how sometimes data diversity just furthers the project of making us visible for the market. Like, for instance, if Facebook is allowing us to record 52 different types of gender identities, is it actually furthering a feminist politics of recognition? Or is it just making us more and more visible in ways that do not really benefit us? So we need to challenge this idea of more data is better, and let's go for diverse data that will enable all to make data-based decisions and change this and reclaim parts of our lives from just becoming fodder for the circuit of datafication. The second proposal I have is about this fact that I think we are all, by the time we are living in 2024, we no longer share this naive and uncritical optimism of the 1990s about the internet as a force of good, or even the early 2000s when we just think the internet and new media technologies, they just help better democracy, and we also don't buy these big data for good narratives. To some extent, the whole project of challenging surveillance capitalism and recovering our freedoms from data violence has become part of our common sense, and that is a good thing. But I just want to point out that while this common sense is evolving and there is increasing conviction about recovering privacy rights, what tends to be forgotten is that freedom from data violence and this data governmentality is not just about reclaiming our data bodies, but about furthering distributive justice in and through the social body of the data commons. And to put this differently, we need to understand that it's not just about guaranteeing that data subjects have the right to dignity, privacy, and personal autonomy, and the right to be represented in decisions about their data, which is now evolving as a discourse on data rights. But we also need to ask the larger question of what is the right to collectively determine how the social commons of data are preserved and promoted for public value and public benefit. Last year, some of us, including Sofia, we all worked together on looking at a feminist digital justice manifesto and what would be the building blocks. And one of the participants actually felt that right now, when you think about digital intelligence, it is a force of a centralized digital intelligence making that disembeds contextual knowledge, and it actually devalorizes the embedded and embodied knowledge of most people. For instance, if you look at Uber, as the scholar Laura Mann has talked about, the local knowledge of the driver about which traffic routes are best in a city, or what would actually mean for a very comfortable ride for the passenger, these kind of tacit knowledges now no longer matter, because the cognitive parts of our labor, irrespective of the jobs we do, they are rendered more and more irrelevant when the data machine takes over the mediation of those transactions. And somewhere we need to challenge that and think about, is it possible to imagine like the way we network and the way we generate intelligence as something of like how the microrhizomatic networks work in forests? Is it possible to think of collective intelligence for the larger social good in a very different way? So these are some questions I leave you with. And my final point here is that oftentimes when we talk about challenging data colonialism, for those of us in the global south, and especially those involved in like the practical politics of advocacy in digital policy, there is a very difficult choice. The concept of data sovereignty is often espoused by nation states of the global south to just further a very narrow techno-nationalist politics. And we have to understand that this is very different from the people's data sovereignty that a feminist digital politics would actually, make us want to vote for. And here I want to give an example unpacking one of the experiments that was like referred to in the passing in the reading material, which is about India's digital public goods and digital public infrastructure strategy. So the official Indian position is that digital public infrastructure like the unified payments interface and the AgriStack, which is an agricultural data exchange that India is trying to build for inclusive innovation that will double farmers' income. This is the official position. All these moves will actually further Indian people's digital sovereignty. This is the official position. But then when you dig past it, there are like more troubling questions.
Sorry, Nandini, we have to be wrapping up really, really soon.
Yeah, I just take 30 seconds more. Yeah. So here, two dominant platforms, two dominant big tech platforms actually control all of the innovations on top of the unified payments interface. And in the farmer data exchange, there is actually no clarity on how the farmers' collective rights to own or demand a public benefit in the innovation that comes on top of it, or even to govern the terms on which their aggregate data gets into the data commons. This is left unspecified. So I just wanted to pose this question here, that narrow nationalistic calls for digital public infrastructure that confuse publicness with openness and interoperability for domestic unicorn building. This has to be different from the people's data sovereignty movement that we all seek, and even the new non-alignment that Ulises was talking about. Thank you.
Sorry, Nandini, that I had to cut you like that. It's really interesting to hear you. But we have to move on with Paola. And our question for you is, how does digital colonialism play out in terms of our landscapes and our societies and our culture?
Well, thank you very much for this question and for the invitation. First, I would like to take 30 seconds to thank you for the work that this great team has been doing with this amazing course. I think it's a true labor of love. And thank you also for preparing the most beautiful slides with amazing illustrations, and also for the effort of using free technologies. Thank you for sharing. I'm very thankful for sharing the space with Nandini, Ulises, Sofia. There are longtime co-conspirators and co-inspirators against unjust systems of oppression. And of course, thank you all for being here. I'll be very short in my response, very quick. And first, I would like to begin stating from where I'm speaking. And I always identify myself as an activist with an academic position. I have always been involved in defending digital rights, first as part of a collective, and then with an organization, and now with Tierra Común. And you can find information about our network in our website. And also my last project with another organization called Surciendo, which is called Tecnoafecciones, that speaks about the eco-social impacts of technological development. So just responding to a comment that that Pia was mentioning, that we are experts in digital colonialism. I would say that unfortunately, we are all experts in digital colonialism and data colonialism because we are all experiencing it. And one crucial aspect that I would like to highlight when I discuss the impact of the digital society on the majority world is the hidden cost of capitalism and the narratives about development. I think that we need to be aware that this model of the world is not sustainable. So that's the first thing. And then that we always need to take into account that there are many impacts associated with sustaining the lifestyle and technologies that we use daily. And I love Arturo Escobar. I don't know if you know this author. He's from Colombia, and he has been thinking a lot and being inspired by social movements in Latin America, in particular the Zapatista movement in Mexico. And he says that there exists a correlation between the intensification of capitalist engineering of the earth and the rise of computation and artificiality, and countering the future effects of these deadly processes by envisioning different futures and futures in difference becomes an onto-epistemic cultural and political endeavor of utmost importance. So this quote for me is very relevant because we need to always take into account that these are not simple problems. We won't find simple solutions. So another aspect is the aspect related to the construction of narratives and imaginaries. There are powerful narratives that obscure the connection between the development of hegemonic technologies and, as Nandini and Ulises were mentioning, unfair labor, the extraction of natural resources, and the impact on communities that are affected by the production of these technologies. And then, of course, we know that these communities are also impacted by the use of these technologies against them. So when I try to explain the connection between technological development and the impact on communities, I like to use the concept of body territory. This is a category that was developed by Maya thinker and activist Lorena Cabnal, but it comes from the struggles of the people in the territory that we call Abya Yala, or Latin America, Central America, the Caribbean. And I like this concept because it's rooted in the ancestral worldviews of communities in the region, in our territories. And it explains why, for many people in in Abya Yala, it's not conceivable the way that we develop, not we, but the way technologies are being developed right now, based on this extraction of natural resources and not aligned with the respect of the environment and also the communities that inhabit those territories. So for me, this concept is important because the body territory is the site of extraction and dispossession in the digital economy. The technologies that we use are data, water, energy, and labor intensive. And all these hegemonic technologies, at the end, what they do is to automate violence at scale. So these technologies are by design extractivist, and their ultimate purpose is to surveil and control bodies and territories to put them at the service of capitalist accumulation. So this extractive logic seeks to grab the spheres that are essential for sustaining life. And this is precisely what the communities in Abya Yala are trying to highlight, that they are defending all the systems that are required to reproduce life, and these technologies are part of the problem. So I just want to, again, stress that the main bearers of the cost of the so-called development are people and territories in the global south, or the majority world. In Latin America, we are now, unfortunately, witnessing how tech corporation owners leverage their power and resources to influence our governments, legislations, economies, and also to shape public opinion. So I think it's important to acknowledge this, to see the connections, and this is why we urgently need political articulation to organize resistance. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So now we can start a conversation. I will just shoot some quick questions for each of you, and then we can continue with the Q&A session. Please feel free to leave your questions there so we can raise them up afterwards. And please check out the links that Sofia sent in the chat, especially the one with the Feminist Digital Justice Manifesto, which is one of the things that Nandini mentioned just now. So first with Ulises, how would you describe the relation between countries at the center and peripheries of the digital world?
Yes, well, obviously, colonialism established a model where colonies existed at the periphery of empire. They were the zones of extraction where wealth was generated and transferred to the center of empire. So there was a very clear distinction between the center and the periphery, although I do like to point out that from the very beginning, that distinction was very porous, very ambiguous, because of the process of reverse migration. As soon as colonies were established, we also had people from the colonies moving to the center of empire. And as some scholars have very well demonstrated, by that process, changing the center of empire too, through migration, through the presence of minorities in those centers. I think today, at least from my perspective, the distinction is even more ambiguous. As Paola mentioned, in some ways, we are all subjects of this new colonialism. If we use any kind of digital device, if we access platforms, it doesn't really matter if you're living in the global north or the global south. At the same time, I think it is very important to make it clear that the costs of connection, as is the title of Nick and my previous book, those costs are not evenly distributed. So as Nandini and Paola have also have put it very well, we still have that legacy of colonialism, of coloniality, what Aníbal Quijano called the coloniality, which basically means that even though colonialism proper officially might be over, the legacy continues. And with data colonialism, I think we see that those costs continue to accrue to some populations more than others. So, and those populations are the traditional victims of colonialism. So when we think about people of color, when we think about women, and when we think about the poor, I think data colonialism, as we see, impacts them to a much larger extent and in a very different way than it might impact me living in the global north. So I think, to go back to your question, Pia, those boundaries have become virtualized in some ways, which kind of makes sense because we're no longer talking only about physical territory, although the discussion should continue to revolve around physical territory and stolen lands and territory that is being polluted. But we do need to sort of take into account this datafication, virtualization of territory, so that no matter where you are, in some ways you are connected to data colonialism. So that distinction between center and periphery no longer holds, although of course there are geopolitics at play. We can talk more about the role of the United States, China, etc.
Well, yeah, those frontiers and those borders start to get blurry, and new players start to enter the game or the dynamics. And that raised me this question for Nandini, because China and its emergence, it's a new player. And do you think that changes the dynamics, this imperial or colonial dynamic? Do you think we can also expect a different type of colonialism because of China's emergence? And lastly, how does Europe fit in this power shifting game?
Right. So a few years ago, I would have just answered the question to say that, China's project in the digital is quite different from the US project, because China wants like market domination without the hegemony to set the terms of the digital discourse. But given many things that have happened since then, I think the answer is no, because now we are in an interesting situation where we see China wanting to do what the US did earlier. And I'm saying this even though I recognize the fact that when you look at browsers and most of like the internet technologies, US corporations control the lion's share of the market share. I'm aware of this fact. But if we look at the infrastructural standard setting processes, the digital Silk Road investments that China is doing, and most recently, the interesting development at this year's ministerial of the World Trade Organization, where you see the US take a very China-like position of saying, let me not negotiate like cross-border data flows at the WTO, and let me preserve national sovereignty. But China eased up its like laws to enable like the export of data across borders. It did this in March 2024, because we all recognize it's a fairly obvious thing what I'm going to say, that somewhere US firms are no longer sure that they can dominate the AI market, and they are very scared of like the Chinese clout in that area. And we see this like in many geopolitical like standoffs. And now I come to the second part of the question, and I'll try to keep it short. So where does Europe figure in this whole picture, right? So we all see that, the EU always has tried to position itself as the harbinger of a third way, a human rights centered digital governance model that is normative, that is respectful of rights, and it tries to hold these positions while also keeping its interests with the US and things like that. And increasingly, in a lot of like different dimensions, we see EU really fear like, the Chinese like entry into the markets and increasing focus on a de-risking strategy, even in the non-digital supply chains, and the latest meeting between Germany and China, leaders being a very good example of this. So coming to this, we see that EU feels that the normative position can no longer enable it maintain its dominance, which is why we see, I think, moves like the Global Digital Gateway project and the attempt to invest in digital infrastructure in the African continent and try to regain like, some influence about how data governance and standards conversations happen. And we see like this as the empirical way through which EU is trying to navigate this. And from a normative lens, if I were to look at it, I think there's a problem in the way EU positions itself as the champion of human rights, because here I will quote something which actually Sofia once said when we were doing this research on menstru apps and cross-border data flows of like sensitive personal data. So if you look at like, apps headquartered in Berlin and things like that, there is one law for EU citizens and one law for like people outside Europe, right? So the EU EU position seems to be that it doesn't matter if data extractivism is done like, in other territories and on other peoples. And this can be seen by so many other things, including like the fact that I mean, why would the EU like not champion other countries' rights to defend themselves against data extractivism? If you look at like historically what the EU has positioned itself at the WTO or anything else, it has never been a champion of people's data sovereignty, right? It's a limited like liberal human rights frame that EU wants to impose on the rest of the world. And my last point being this is that there's so much work which already shows that the liberal human rights frame divides some people into rights-bearing citizens and all others into subjects of the colony. Like we know this like for a long time. So we would need like a different type of radical insurgent human rights paradigm to actually think about data rights. And I think we should stop looking to EU for answers and EU as the gold standard. And in our own mind as digital rights activists, we need to seek the standard setting elsewhere and through other processes.
Thank you, Nandini. A very interesting point of view. Now to you, Paola, do you think there's a way to resist or to counterbalance these forces or these new dynamic forces?
Yes, Pia, thank you very much for this question. And absolutely, there is always space for resistance. There has always been historically, and people have been resisting against these oppressive systems. And I would say that, of course, as we understand violence is multidimensional, I would say that resistance is also multidimensional. And the expressions of resistance are varied. So for me, resistance needs to be understood as a way to make space and to create the conditions of possibility for life to be defended. So we are now facing this terrible climate crisis. And I would say, going back to this idea of how people from the communities in Abya Yala are understanding the fight against climate injustice, is that we need to make sure that we are supporting life-sustaining systems. So as I was saying, for me, resistance is always expressed, sustaining a daily basis at all levels, from the micro to the macro, from the material, the immaterial. And there are, going back to this idea of the body territory category, I would say it entails a body politics, this politics of the body that is associated with the ways of being, knowing, feeling, doing, and living in the world. And also, of course, the geopolitics, or this politics of geoplanetary relations. So there are many ways to resist. I believe that we all know what are the expressions of that resistance in our own lives and the lives of our communities. We are doing, we're resisting, like creating alternative narratives, using alternative technologies, defending the land, contesting these models of the world that are against the planet. We are also working on leveraging alternative knowledge and also showing these stories of resistance. I would say that we need to acknowledge that the world is pluriversal, as the Zapatistas would say, and that we have to defend that. We have to defend the multidimensional nature of humanity, because that's the only way in which we can guarantee the continuation of life in the planet. And I also would like to mention that Yasnaya Aguilar, which is another indigenous thinker from Mexico, she says that ancestral people in Mexico they have shown how to resist because they have a long history of resistance against colonialism and coloniality. And she always says that we need to recognize the centrality of community organizing, these community ways of managing life that the communities have been defending over like centuries, because that's the way in which they have found that it's possible to continue sustaining life. So I would say, yeah, I have another friend, and she says that we need to take advantage of the cracks in the system, and we need to use those cracks to create space to defend our body territories. And yeah, I think we cannot be, I mean, I know that Sofia says that being optimistic is, oh no, that's Ivana that says that being optimistic sometimes is not being responsible. But I would say that in a way, I'm optimistic in the possibility of people organizing and defending the ways in which we can definitely fight for a world in which we can all have a place. That's it.
Thank you very much, Paola. Now, this question is for everyone. What do you think a decolonial, like a decolonized world, internet, would look like? Do you want to start, Ulises?
Sure, I'll give it a try. I mean, to me, very simply, it means a decolonial internet or decolonizing data means non-extractive internet and non-extractive platforms where the data, we have control and ownership over our data, and the environment and the infrastructure is not just controlled by corporations for the sole purpose of generating wealth for the few. I'm not yet at a point where I'm saying let's overthrow capitalism and do away with the concept of private property. Just from a realistic perspective, I don't think that's gonna, that's a realizable short-term goal. But I do think even working within capitalism, there's a lot that we can do, for instance, to promote competition, to question this idea that in order for us to have great technologies, we need to have huge monopolies that have total control over the processes of production and our data. So I think, decolonizing the internet, decolonizing data means working, as Latin American activists have told us repeatedly, working within the system, against the system, and beyond the system. We need to work at all three levels simultaneously. So quitting Instagram, quitting TikTok is not going to be enough. Working within the system means traditional mainstream politics, putting pressure on our governments to pass regulation that's good for us. Working against the system means protest, means learning from all of these past and present decolonial movements that Paola was mentioning. In many cases, we are part of their problem, but we can still learn from them. And because, working within or against the system still means being defined by the system, I think decolonizing data also requires us to think beyond the system, imagine new alternatives. For us, I think imagination has always been key to this process of decolonization, because in colonialism, when colonialism couldn't be resisted with the body, it could always be resisted with the mind and with the spirit. So we have very rich traditions of cultural responses to colonialism that we need to learn from and we need to continue.
Now with you, Nandini, do you want to answer the question?
Yeah. So just like very briefly, I think that a decolonial internet for me would mean an internet with new materialities, new internet publics, and new forms of governance. And to just explain this in a very short way, the new materialities point harks back to what Ulises was saying now, and like earlier also in the presentation, where this is actual art installation called Deep Down Tidal, which I will encourage everyone to see, which actually shows how the underground cables of the internet, they trace the transatlantic slave trade route. The installation actually shows us that, and how the internet's very backbone is built on certain extractivist like models of data, in a very visceral way. It shows us that, and that actually needs to change, where rather than the client server paradigm that supports like the main platforms, we need like a different internet, which is actually the many to many connections where all nodes are equal, and that's not the case in the platformized internet. The second point pertains to what Paula was saying about a pluriversal world, where right now in the dominant internet, only some voices are heard and some voices are amplified, and we don't have an internet that's actually like managing to sustain plural publics, right? So what would that really mean? And finally, the point about like governance is that right now we don't like actually govern the internet as a global public good. Though there was a lot of hype around this, the transition of ICANN and the critical internet resources to a truly international setup that remains incomplete, and the US has extraordinary control over the very basics of the internet, and this is not like something that can be the basis of a decolonial internet. And I think that finally it means that rather than like the internet of the stream, which is the platform model, we need to restore the hyperlink to its prominent place, and we want like a World Wide Web where all hyperlinks are equal. That's not the case in the platformized internet.
Thank you, Nandini. Now to you, Paola.
Well, really short. will be really short here. There is an activist, a queer activist in Bolivia. Her name is Maria Galindo, and I like a lot well, her work, but she has a book and called "There is no decolonization without depatriarchalization." And I would also add without like decommodification. So for me, a decolonial internet should be also a feminist internet. And it should be, as Nandini was saying, an internet that is built for the common good and not for the market. So for me, that internet should be rooted in the struggles of people of our territories, deeply respecting their bodies, their worldviews, their cultures, their languages, and particularly taking into account the impacts of that technological development now is having in these bodies and territories. This decolonial, feminist, anti-capitalist internet should, of course, be respectful of the bodies and the territories of the majority world.
Thank you very much, Paola. Now I would like to open the floor for the Q&A. Do you have any questions that you have read, Sofia, so we can share with us?
Well, so far, it was really interesting, all the panelists, and thank you for the reference also for my work. I feel flattered that you also find my work interesting, and I love working with you guys, so it's really amazing. But to the questions, I wanted to say that yeah, the question about labor was raised in some questions and comments that were raised, especially about cheap labor and how these technologies serve themselves from cheap labor. Was a big concern. Now I pick, and also they ask a specific question about war technologies and how they reinforce colonialist and imperialist practices. I will not pick that because we will address that on week 5, which is going to be about surveillance and security. So stay tuned to answer that question for week 5. Now to the questions that I do want to raise here. I think I have many that are really interesting, but I'm going to pick 3. So Nandini, there's a question for you. It says, can you elaborate about the practice of algorithmic governance in India? Has it been also used in policing in India? So if you can talk about the algorithmic governance in India, it will be amazing. So you can tell us a little bit, because I know that the Indian government has been working a lot around these issues. And also to Ulises, do you see a correlation between data colonialism and imperialism? Do you believe that imperial perspective has deepened, albeit with other instruments, with the advance of digital technologies in technologically dependent countries? And then to Paola, I think it's interesting that this question that is, what is the role of racism in digital and data colonialism in relation to the role of historical colonialism? So the matter of race and how this interacts with data colonialism. So those are 3 questions I picked.
Which one wants to start?
Okay, so I can just respond to the specific question, on India, because the others are broader and interrelated, I think. Yes, now if we look at like algorithmic governance in India, the first part of the question, I understood that to mean like the way Indian regulation looks at like AI technologies and development. That's a little bit like non-existent or missing, because we don't really have a conversation on the AI Act and or anything analogous to that. And we also have a personal data protection legislation that doesn't do a good job of either addressing corporate or state data violence adequately. So that's the regulatory basis. And yes, in the Indian police system, there is a consistent attempt to build a monitoring and tracking system for predictive policing and profiling of criminals, right? And this basically means that those from the most vulnerable and marginalized groups of the population, those who belong to certain Dalit and tribal communities, they are disproportionately at risk of being profiled and unfairly charged and things like this. There's a lot of work on this already, and I could share some links subsequently on this, and I'll just stop here. Yeah.
Yes, and I can address the next question about imperialism. And as I was looking over the chat, I know someone also asked a question about feudalism. I mean, I think whatever lens you find useful to understand these problems I think it's fine with me. I know there might be semantical differences. Some people talk about the digital colonialism versus data colonialism, and some people talk about data capitalism and digital feudalism. Whatever term you prefer, I think it's fine. I think for me, the main difference is that yes, when I think about feudalism, I think a very localized project that didn't have a global dimension. So that's why I don't use that term. And likewise with imperialism, I think to me that suggests something that could potentially come in the future. In other words, at this stage of the data colonialism, I think it's about extraction. It's about this frontier mentality of acquiring territories, data territories. If this remains unchallenged, or if basically the situation gets worse, then I think we would get to a place of perhaps data imperialism, not just colonialism. I would assume that would come with more direct forms of violence, less opportunities to resist. I think right now there's still some space to resist, to think of alternatives. Usually when we talk about imperialism, for instance, in connection to the United States, we think about cultural imperialism, which means that the way of thinking itself has changed so that it's difficult to imagine alternatives. I would hope that we're not there yet. So, which is why we don't use the word imperialism at this point. But I did want to go back to, I think, a point that Paola brought up, just to wrap up, which is a point about pessimism, because it does seem very overwhelming to think about these things. It does seem like there's very little opportunities for organizing and for resisting. I think those opportunities are still there. So while we to go back to a quote by a famous Italian philosopher, Antonio Gramsci, I think we do need to have a pessimism of the intellect, but an optimism of the will. We need to be critical about describing this system, which is depressing to think about, but I think we can always remain optimistic in terms of our capacity for imagination. Even as AI seems to be occupying more of our culture, it's also it's also positive and enlightening to see how humans are reacting to AI creatively. So I think that space for imagination, that space for resistance, is always there, and it's something we can take, we feel good about.
Do we have one question left, or I think we have more time. So if Sofia, you want to share another questions from the Q&A?
Yeah, no, I raised the question about racism and how Paola.
Yeah.
Paola?
Yeah, maybe something that we didn't emphasize too much during our presentation is the nexus between the colonial system and racism. So the colonial system gave rise to racism, and racism, together with sexism, are at the basis of capitalist accumulation. So when we speak about colonialism and its enduring forms throughout time, what Aníbal Quijano calls coloniality, it's important to understand that the matrix of power is based on the ontological and epistemological differences. This means that the colonial matrix implied to create a system to differentiate, to classify people, and to define which bodies were disposable or not, which beings can be considered human and or not, and of course, associated with that, which knowledge is valid. So this matrix of power creates not only a system that allows the extraction of natural resources, it creates a whole system of values that allows the classification of people, and then creates this subordination between some people and others based on racial and gender differences and other differences. So this is the way in which dispossession and violence is legitimated. And well, there's a lot of literature within the decolonial framework that explains precisely how modernity needed colonialism, that the development of the metropolis, the European metropolis, and the whole Western, the imposition of the Western ideology was related to this rationality in which some people are considered disposable because of their race or their gender.
Thank you, Paola. Does anyone have any follow-up on what you just said? Or if not, I think, yeah, we do have a little more time if we have more questions to share.
Yes. So one question that was raised was about alternatives in technological tools, like what alternative technologies we should use that are decolonial or that have another perspective. So yeah, that was one question. And now we was raised another one that is that building on the previous question of imperialism, what do you think about Palestine and an example of data digital colonialism by the Zionist settler colonial project that is also upheld or backed by US imperialism? So this is a really tough question. We are going to address a little bit more about this on week 5, but if anyone wants to jump in, they are free to talk about it, and then about alternatives.
Does anyone want to jump in?
Sure, I'll give it a try. As far as alternative technologies, I think the good news is that a lot of these technologies are already there, and it's important that we play around with them and try to use them as much as we can. I think we do have to remain vigilant, however. I think sometimes we tend to reify open source as a solution without thinking that all technologies exist in a social context. And so, there's no such thing as just a neutral or a good technology. I think a good example of this is just the fact that the Android operating system is open source. And that doesn't stop the extractivism from happening. In fact, it facilitates it. So that's what I would say about, open source technologies, which I'm a big supporter of and believe that we need to continue to experiment with, but just remaining vigilant. As far as Palestine, I understand you folks are going to talk about that in a couple of weeks. It's a complicated discussion, but I just wanted to mention that there are groups doing very good work in this field. For instance, the campaign No Tech for Apartheid, which was happening well before the current conflict in Gaza. This is a project, I think you can just go to the website No Tech for Apartheid, which tries to bring attention to the role that companies like Google and Amazon play in supporting the Israeli state, which is an apartheid state using technologies in many ways to maintain this apartheid. And companies like big tech companies are very much involved in that infrastructure as well. So, I mean, if anyone has more resources, please do share them. But that's just an example of one.
Maybe I'll jump in just to reinforce this idea. For me, these hegemonic technologies are basically technologies of war. And I do believe what the African philosopher Akile Mbembe says, this is part of a necropolitics, a politics of, well, he speaks about sovereignty as the capacity of who has the right to decide who can live and who can die. And for me, it's important to understand also the role of current hegemonic technologies in war conflicts. And we do have to understand that these technologies, of course, as Ulises was mentioning, these are not neutral technologies. These are basically technologies for war. And in this sense, we do have to support technologies that are built in a different way, and also that are trying to support a different model of the world, because the technologies of war are technologies that are part of this model of the world that is based, as I was mentioning, with this idea of extracting, dispossessing, and also controlling and surveilling specific bodies and territories. And this is precisely what we are trying to emphasize when we speak about coloniality of power. It is not is not casual, because these technologies are used to reinforce this difference between those countries, peoples, bodies, and territories that are disposable, and those that are deciding who has the right to live and the right to die. So I just would like to emphasize that, that we need to be very conscious.
I just wanted to add a couple of things to what Ulises and Paula have already so eloquently described. I think it's important to remember this idea that we are talking about alternative technology ecosystems as an alternative innovation ecosystems, and we are not like talking about tools or technologies themselves, because we have seen this move where first there was this uncritical celebration of open source, and now we see the same thing happening with digital public good standards and digital public infrastructure, and these technologies get taken out of context and then they just get celebrated, and that's really a problem. I also wanted to highlight how there are all these moves where there's this attempt to bind innovation with ethics, and then there's all this like discussion about procedural fairness in tech innovation, particularly when it comes to AI innovation. But somewhere like, this entire discussion on procedural fairness, it takes away the spotlight from questions of inequality and intersectional injustice, and we need to be careful about that. And the final point is that, like, somewhere if we know that, as we discussed right in the beginning, if there is a path dependency now where the trajectories of technological development are shaped by digital colonialism and the colonialism capitalism complex, if that is how we want to term it, somewhere we can't like have an alternative unless we kind of like shift the entire system and rethink of what the technological shift and the knowledge society we want to create would be. And that means that we need to engage in this very difficult space of global digital governance, which is quite fragmented, and it's also captured by a particular form of like elitism in multi-stakeholder politics, which means big tech also sets the rules that they have to follow. So we could probably start by engaging with that, because like Paula was quoting her friend, that would give us the cracks or the spaces we need to engage with maybe.
Thank you very much to the three of you. Now, do you have some final words, some encouraging words do you want to share with our students in terms of how to be motivated to live in a decolonized world or decolonized internet maybe?
Should I go first? Just to get us started.
Yes, to finish in a happier mood.
All right. Yeah, well, yes. I think, the notion of sovereignty, I think it's very important. But as Nandini said, a sovereignty that is not just state-based, but community-based, group-based. I think, when it's true, we cannot look to, for instance, Europe to provide the legislative framework to solve these problems, as we saw even recently in their AI Act. And as Nandini mentioned in another context, they usually have one set of rules that benefits European citizens, but another set of rules for the rest of the world. We can see that very much when it comes to their migration control technologies, where it is, while the EU might protect its own citizens, they allow the extraction of data from non-citizens to continue as usual. So I think this notion of sovereignty will be important, but I think we do need to come up with our own definitions. Someone mentioned quickly, I forgot to mention, for instance, a possible non-aligned technologies movement. If the original non-aligned movement was about states saying we don't agree with capitalism or with communism, we have to find a third way. I think we're trying to do the same with an online technologies movement. We should do the same, which is come up as civil society, as the peoples of the world, come up with our own alternatives, which is going to be difficult, but I think the struggle itself can give us a sense of meaning and purpose. Thank you.
Thank you, Ulises. Nandini, Paola, do you have some final words?
Well, maybe I would like to bring another indigenous thinker from Guatemala, Maya Quiche, a sociologist called Gladys Zul, and she speaks about the communal forms of resistance. And I here, like, just supporting the idea that Ulises was mentioning, I believe that there is no way to resist other than organizing in like politically organizing the ways in which we would like to live in community, and defending, of course, as I was mentioning, the right to exist in difference. And yeah, I would say that's for me, like, something that is truly important in my daily life.
Thank you very much, Paola. Now to you, Nandini.
I can just give you something from the Indian People's Movement's experience, where there's been a long struggle for Jal, Jungle, Jameen, which means like water, land, and forest need to be the commons. So maybe we need to move from capitalism to commonsification.
Thank you very much to the three of you. It was such a pleasure to have you here, to hear you. Thank you also to the whole TNI team for the great organizational support. So this was, now we're wrapping up. This was our third masterclass. Next week, the theme of our course will be the digital trade agenda. This will be a critical follow-up to today's session because digital trade has become the way in which big tech companies legally block their business model and get tax cuts worldwide. And that allows them to carry out the data extractivism that we have seen throughout this course. Trade rules are also the key ways digital colonialism is maintained, and this legal architecture is not well known as it is disguised under the jargon of e-commerce, which you may have heard. This is to pretend that it is just about selling goods online. But these rules curtail democracy, culture, access to information, and many other things we will see in next class. On Monday, the module will be opened on our course website with lots of great educational resources to read and to learn from. And then on Wednesday, the 24th, at the same time as today, sorry for the inconvenience and sending you the other message, we will be joined in our masterclass with Deborah James, who is the Director of International Programs at the Center for Economic and Policy Research and the coordinator of the global Our World is Not for Sale network. We will also be joined by Bahini Naidu, who is the program coordinator of the Trade for Development program of the South Center, a former trade negotiator for South Africa, whose trade negotiating areas include trading services, e-commerce, and the digital economy. And finally, we will be joined by Christina Arion, who is Associate Professor at the Institute for Information Law at the University of Amsterdam, and a researcher on the governance of international digital technologies and global data value chains from the perspective of European law and international economic law. So thank you all once again for joining us. Please take one quick minute to fill the poll on your screen, as this will help us to evaluate the session and to use it for the future ones. And we will also leave the chat open for a few minutes. So if you want to wrap up some of the conversations, and if you have any suggestions for improvements, don't hesitate to email us, to our email, to write to our forum, and we'll be open. The masterclass will be uploaded in the Moodle afterwards. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.